Hello there and welcome back. I figured since in the next video we're going to start getting into denoising and regraining our footage, we'd start to talk a little bit more about exactly what grain is. The first thing I want to cover is what exactly is the difference between noise and grain, because you may have heard these terms used interchangeably. Well, the concept behind both of them is pretty similar. It's random imperfections in your image. And the main difference between these is that grain comes from film stock and noise comes from digital cameras. Grain is generally thought to be more aesthetically pleasing because it doesn't break up the image into random red, green, and blue patterns. It's solely luminance based, which you can see on our right here. Noise, on the other hand, has varying intensities of your random pattern for the red, green, and blue channel. It also doesn't feel quite as organic, which is another reason it's not desired. Regardless of if you have grain or noise, those terms are interchangeable and we will be approaching them in the same way. So, as compositors, what do we need to keep in mind when we're looking at grain in our shot? Well, there are really two major things. The first is that any composited element that we're adding, it needs to have grain applied that matches our original footage. And what do we mean by matched grain? Well, we're looking for these five characteristics. The first is pretty obvious. It's the intensity. We want to make sure that the grain we're adding isn't too intense or too subtle. It needs to blend with the footage correctly. And this is tied in closely with luminance curve. So what exactly does luminance curve mean? Well, grain is not uniformly applied across the image. Typically, your blacks and your dark points are going to have significantly more visible grain than your highlights. This is because of a couple reasons. In digital cameras, it means that less light is reaching the sensor, and so more random mistakes end up happening. And in the bright areas, plenty of data is getting there, and so it's typically not as noisy. Another reason is humans are much better at seeing the differences in contrast in dark areas as opposed to very light areas. And so matching your luminance curve is very important. Let's take a brief look at this example. Here is grain uniformly applied across the whole image. The luminance curve is off. You can tell it looks very strange. And now let's go to the properly applied luminance curve. You'll see everything is sitting much more nicely. I'm using the exact same grain between these two. The only difference is I've turned off our luminance curve in the wrong example. The next thing we're going to have to keep in mind is the size of our grain. We need to make sure that we're matching the individual, let's call them particles, between our elements and our footage. You don't want to make them too big or too small. That's pretty self explanatory. The next thing is that grain can come in varying levels of sharpness or softness, so you also need to make sure that matches. And the final thing is matching the irregularity and the shape. In other words, matching the general pattern of the grain structure. In general, this isn't as much of a problem with modern day digital cameras because the sensors have gotten pretty good. There's not a lot of patterns, the noise is pretty uniform throughout. So, those are the five keys to matching grain. We'll go over practically matching grain with these in the next video in Nuke, but I just wanted to briefly talk about the concept behind it. Now, let's move on to the second way that grain affects us as compositors, and that is grain may need to be removed from our elements for one of two reasons. The first is that the grain on our element either isn't moving or doesn't match our footage, so we have to remove the grain and then reapply correct grain. And the second is that removing grain can help some of the work that we're doing be much more precise, especially when you're keying. Let's take a look at an example key where one side is degrained and the other is not. So here we have the alpha of our key, and as you can see on the right side, where grain is left in our key, we're getting a lot of chattering at the edge, and that's very common when you work on keys that are grained. But once you remove all the noise, you can see on the left, that's a very smooth key. There might be a tiny bit of chattering, but it's much more subtle than the original. So it's very important to keep this in mind whenever you're trying to do a key. And that sums up what to keep in mind when you're looking at grain in your footage. As long as you're following these principles, you'll be set to go. Grain is typically pretty black and white. It's either right or it's wrong. And what's very important to keep in mind is that just because you're using the exact same camera as another shot does not mean that your grain will be similar. Grain varies greatly under different lighting conditions. It depends how the camera's set up. Is it daylight? Are you set at a night scene? It really depends. So each shot should be approached as if it's a brand new grain structure because you will see differences. Let's go ahead and move on to the next video where we'll put these concepts into action. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.